I have found that, given the proper incentive, anyone can be made to play my game.
Look at you, the first move and already you're nervous.
You have never faced a duelist like me before. I know every move you'll make before you can even make it.
This has been the year of Yu-Gi-Oh for me, with me talking about more of the various subjects in the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise, like characters like Jack Atlas and Crow Hogan, fuck you Crow, and talking about the various video games that came out years ago. It's been a wonderful walk down memory lane for this series. But for all my talk about old school Yu-Gi-Oh games, which are mostly focused on the original series of Yu-Gi-Oh, I astonishingly haven't talked about the initial series all that much. Most I did was talk about the ladies of Yu-Gi-Oh and how their writing wasn't all that great, and that I shouldn't be what I talk about. Although I'd argue that my channel isn't all negative, I do want people to understand that there are positive aspects to the entire series of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I figured that since I love to talk about villains on this channel, whether it be or this guy, and of course,
Don't fuck with this, Senator!
I love talking about villains here. Hell, they're probably my favorite videos to make, and I think we should continue this trend and mix it with the topic of Yu-Gi-Oh! So you got yourself an interesting selection of villains to choose from. I obviously do have my issues with each Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, but if there's one thing I can always compliment, it's the villains in them. Of course, if I really had to pick a villain who I think was probably the best, it'd have to be the first.
Tell me something, my old friend. Did you like watching cartoons in your youth? Is that a no? Kaiba, you're even more cold-hearted than I thought. For me, they were the absolute best. And none was closer to my heart than the misadventures of one tricky hare.
Maximillion Pegasus. That's right, the first major antagonist of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, and in my opinion, probably one of the most iconic villains in not only Yu-Gi-Oh, but anime as well. I'm MangaKamen, and join me as we go back to the past and talk about Yu-Gi-Oh's greatest villain, Pegasus.
I took your grandpa's soul. I look incredible.
Maximillion Pegasus, or known as Pegasus J. Crawford in the manga, is the breakout villain for the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, and boy does he make an impression with his looks. Just a look at the character's design, it actually tends to be rather out there, especially when it comes to shonen anime. And that's because Yu-Gi-Oh at its core isn't a show about two characters punching each other and throwing energy blasts. Well, most of the time. No. Yu-Gi-Oh, at least in the original, is all about the card game, where the name of the game is strategy, so wearing fancy clothes does make sense. You don't need to worry about getting your clothes caught when you're playing a card game or people pulling your hair in a fight. So when you look at Pegasus, with his long silver hair which covers half of his face and his bright red suit, the character immediately catches your eye. In comparison to that of the main character's coloring, Yugi, whose outfit at the time had these blacks and blues, with his hair being completely colorful, it sets up a very good contrast with the main character. It also just stands out from other villains. Pegasus' design, although simple with the basic colors of silver and red, is a good combination that makes him memorable. His design is subtle, and that's what makes Pegasus honestly a lot more notable. In the context of the story of Yu-Gi-Oh, Pegasus is the creator of the game Duel Monsters, designing the rules of the game and having a fondness of games and cartoons, which we'll get back to later. There's not a lot of information of Pegasus' creation as a character, and I don't know if there's going to be more to get at this point, so we'll focus on Pegasus' backstory for this section. Born to a wealthy casino tycoon, the young Pegasus was well off. He had to be, since his father owned a lot of casinos. One night when Pegasus was 10 and he was attending one of his father's parties in Las Vegas, Pegasus met Cecilia, the girl who would become the love of Pegasus' life. Ah, love at first sight. Though we don't know too much about their relationship, we do know that when they were in their mid-teens, the two had decided to live together. Pegasus would often paint her portraits, and if you're talking about the English dub, the two were actually married. However, tragedy struck when Cecilia passed away from an illness at the age of 17. Unable to accept the death of his loved one, Pegasus scoured the world in order to find any method of reviving the dead, a foolish endeavor for someone in love. The Egyptians' belief in the afterlife caught Pegasus' attention though, so his travels led him to the tombs where the Millennium Items were held, where he met Shadi, the guardian of the Millennium Items, who warned him that his solution to death would not be in the tomb. Not heeding Shadi's warnings, Pegasus followed him, and as such,
Against his wishes, or so I thought. Although the passage seemed to lead to the bowels of the earth, still I followed.
After that impromptu eye surgery, Pegasus was graced with a vision of Cecilia, and when he held her in his arms,
Cecilia. I found you, my darling. We're reunited at long last.
But be warned, seeing's not the same as touching.
Damn it, 4Kids, what in the world is with that sound effect? I should point out in the original Japanese, it was pretty clear that Pegasus had lost his eye and had blood streaming down his face. And there was a much more dignified sound effect for this scene. It's still kinda goofy, but it has a lot more meaning, like the happiness that Pegasus got was snuffed out.
But then you exploded again. You really need to stop doing that.
Regardless of terrible editing choices, after his eye was replaced, Pegasus began his plan to revive his lover. The first thing he did was establish industrial illusions, and after a second trip to Egypt, Pegasus discovered the Shadow Games and based his game Duel Monsters off of it. And because of that, the young businessman was able to create the world's greatest card game, a game so impressive that the landscape of the world was changed to revolve around these mighty cards, all done within 7 years. Although at this point, Pegasus also had magical abilities that allowed him to read people's minds and steal souls, so that probably helped too. Capitalism at its finest, folks. Still, Pegasus' plan was in the works, and during that time, he had received an offer from Kaiba Corporation to help develop virtual simulation technology, which would allow Duel Monsters to be a more enhanced experience. And with the advent of Solid Vision tech from Kaiba Corp, that sparked an idea in Pegasus' mind. You see, Solid Vision had the ability to create holographic projections that were more lifelike, and the holograms could even inflict damage to people at some points. So, with a combination of magic and technology, Pegasus hatched his plan, and the timing couldn't be better. Around this time, Seto Kaiba, the uncontested champion on Duel Monsters, was defeated by an upstart with some oddly shaped hair. So, making a deal with the bigwigs of Kaiba Corp, Pegasus attempted to overthrow the Seto Kaiba so he could take over the company and get his hands on the technology. A man who not only made his own company, got magic powers, and even managed to establish a hostile takeover of one of the world's greatest tech companies. Not bad for a 24-year-old guy. Yeah, Pegasus is 24 years old. Surprised me too! I do want to point out that while Pegasus is a villain, he does have a backstory that is really understandable. And I'm sure at one point or another, we've lost someone who we truly cared about, and we'll do anything we could in order to save them or get them back, even if it was at the cost of another person.
Oh, bandit boy, it appears 4Kids gave you back your gun. Well, we can't have that on children's programming.
Of course, a backstory for a villain is only one element to creating a great villain. What we need to really consider is how Pegasus presents himself, as a character and as a threat. If we're following the anime, we're introduced to Pegasus in the very first episode after Kaiba's defeat. Of course, when the anime first aired and most people weren't familiar with the Yugioh manga, he was a mysterious figure. It wouldn't be until the second episode that we get an actual introduction to Pegasus, where he's properly introduced as the eccentric millionaire who created the very game of the entire series. But that's not where it stops. In the same episode, our protagonist Yugimoto receives a videotape and an invitation to the Duelist Kingdom tournament, and thanks to his magical abilities, Pegasus challenged Yugi to a duel using a VHS tape. On a time limit, mind you, but still a duel, and Pegasus wins. Yes, it was by timeout. But hey, anyone who plays Speedstrift nowadays kinda plays that way. You can tell the age of Pegasus is long gone with this damn archetype. Pegasus defeated the main protagonist of the show in the second episode. Not just defeated Yugi, but thanks to his abilities to read Yugi's mind with his Millennium Eye, Pegasus was able to counter a lot of Yugi's moves. Now you can't just chalk that up to Pegasus knowing what Yugi's next move would have to be. Instead, what Pegasus did was prep his deck for cards that Yugi would use, like Dragon Capture Jar and an unknown trap to stop zombies. There was more prep made for the duel. Yes, Pegasus did win via time limit, but he still did win, and because of that, he was able to establish himself as a very unique threat, especially when he shows he's able to steal people's souls in the process. I really love this introduction to Pegasus. How many villains can you say that are able to pull off an introduction like this? Not only is he able to appear in such an unconventional manner via VHS tape, but is also able to get the upper hand on the main character so early in the series. Pegasus establishes himself as a very indomitable threat, and even though he does prepare, the biggest danger is his Millennium Eye, which allows him to steal souls, create shadow games, and of course the most iconic power, the mind scanning ability, which is actually a pretty brilliant power when your entire show is based on a card game. where you can see what your opponent's hand is and understand what their strategy will be, planning for it and dealing with it. And with Pegasus stealing the soul of Yugi's grandfather, it provides a great motivation for Yugi to compete in the Duelist Kingdom tournament. It's a breath of fresh air when it comes to taking someone the protagonist cares about, and it isn't the main love interest. Hooray for equality! And throughout the tournament, Pegasus has this air of indomitable power. He's literally the king of the hill, and we're given more reason to see how dangerous an opponent Pegasus is.
I can sense you, Kaiba. But are you hunting for me? Or am I hunting you?
There's the story that Kaiba tells where he elicits that how at a very important tournament, Pegasus literally treated the up-and-coming champion Bandit Keith as nothing more than a plaything. Pegasus literally wrote down some notes and called a kid over to play in his stead.
Hey, what are you doing? Asking for help's illegal!
I don't need help. A child could defeat you, Bandit Keith, and I'm going to prove it.
But I just started to learn how to play last week.
Just follow these instructions and you'll win.
And in a stunning upset, the kid managed to defeat Bandit Keith. With the note that Pegasus left the kid, it had everything he needed in order to beat the American Intercontinental Champion. The next time was when Pegasus faces off against Kaiba. Still with his powers of the Millennium Eye, Pegasus was able to counteract almost all of Kaiba's moves, even to the point where he was able to steal one of Kaiba's Blue Eyes White Dragons.
Dragon. Was I right? Tell me I was right. I was right? I so hope I was right.
Enough! Here, take it!
Now the most valuable card in your deck is mine.
And even turning Kaiba's Crush card, a combo that was used to severely cripple Yugi's deck in the duo's match, against Kaiba.
And it's too late for him to do a single thing about it!
Hurry up and call up your attack, Kaiba! It's a trap!
I'm afraid this is far worse than a trap.
I'd also like to point out that earlier in this duel, Kaiba had come to the realization that Pegasus was reading his cards through mind reading.
That's impossible. There's no way he could have seen my blue eyes before I played it.
That could only mean one thing.
Pegasus is planning to draw my dragon under his control.
You read my mind. And soon I will make him a toon just like I did your other blue eyes.
Or some other form of cheating. So Kaiba had ditched his hand and relied on top decking, so the method that Pegasus had in order to cheat was rendered useless, and he had to just rely on his skills in that point. Well, until he came to the thought that Kaiba knows every card in his own deck. But that's not touching on the fact that Pegasus is the creator of Duel Monsters, the guy who made the game, and as such has access to countless cards that haven't even been released to the public or are straight up broken. So cards like Toon World, which can make monsters into toons and making them nigh invincible, or even cards like Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Restrict. So Pegasus as a villain has a lot going on for him power-wise, especially in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! Still, that power is meaningless if the character is boring. Luckily for us, Pegasus is the farthest thing from being boring.
As long as I have the power of my Millennium Eye, you cannot defeat me. Even know how the silly device even works. Do I spin it like a top or roll it like a ball?
Cut the theatrics.
Ooh!
Pegasus as a character has a lot going for him. Not only is he a threat as we've demonstrated, but he's also entertaining. And that's because he has personality.
It's my turn!
It's clear for his age of 24, still not over that.
Oh my, sounds like someone needs a hug.
He's got a bit of a childish demeanor. He often goofs around in duels and even tries to act as if he's helpless against his opponents. And at times you can think he's incompetent at the whole thing. Then you remember that this guy has the ability to steal people's souls and put them into cards. And then he can read your mind too. He's a dangerous opponent in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! But he's also entertaining, and he has his level of egotism that he can back up. He'll often refer to people as boy, like Yugi boy or Kaiba boy. It's a playful way of demeaning the characters and how Pegasus doesn't see them as a threat. It's in the same manner as an old man would mess with a younger person. Again, Pegasus, 24. He enjoys toying with his opponents. He's a man who enjoys cartoons and having a good time, and also white wine spritzers.
No more white wine spritzers before bedtime for me.
Honestly, a lot of the reason why I think the performance for Pegasus is done so well is because of the voice actor, Darren Dustin. He did a marvelous job with the voice work of Pegasus, since a lot of the added goofiness does play with Pegasus's character. It adds much more to the playful manner of him, and I do think the English version works better for him because unlike the rest of the cast, Pegasus is actually American.
Pegasus was facing the Intercontinental Champion, Bandit Keith, who apparently likes to remind everybody that he's from America. You can't beat me because I'm an American!
Hell, in the Japanese version of the anime, Pegasus would often splice into English.
Unbelievable! Bravo! What? Got them!
Still, I prefer the anime dub. It makes him sound a lot more flamboyant and a lot more memorable.
You truly are a stubborn one, aren't you?
Can it? You ain't talking your way out of this one. Now hand over that prize money or else.
Oh, certainly, Keith. I'll do whatever you say. Just give my body a moment to recover from the complete paralysis that your terrifying demands have shocked me into.
I should also point out that Pegasus does have a more noble side to him as well. He does generally seem to care for his game and other games too. It's why when Duke Devlin came to Pegasus for his game of Dungeon Dice Monsters, not only did Pegasus humor the kid by playing his game, but also funded it and allowed monsters that were originally duel monsters to be added to Dungeon Dice Monsters. And while he doesn't stop Bandit Keith from cheating, he does point out when Joey Wheeler lays out his deduction from Keith's own words. Obviously, there's also the tragedy of Pegasus that we went into. Not to say it justifies his actions, but it adds a lot more to his character. Although you have to consider the fact that Pegasus uses Toon monsters, and this to me actually ties into his motivations. What's his ultimate goal? To reclaim Cecilia's soul with the Millennium items and imbue it into a realistic hologram via Kaiba Corp's technology. Toon World essentially takes the monsters and turns them into immortal Toons.
Blue Eyes, attack with all your might. White lightning. No way!
And that's what Pegasus essentially wants to do with Cecilia, to make her into an immortal hologram with her soul. There's also the fact that cartoons are a major part of Pegasus' past, and one he's not willing to let go, which is parallel with his love for Cecilia, where he can't let his love for her disappear. Keeping in line with his personality and deck, a lot of time Pegasus cards have a fair bit of defensive and control elements. There's the Toon World where his tunes are protected, and cards like Dragon Capture Jar, Prophecy, and Magic Neutralizing Force are cards to help him be a lot more defensive against his opponents, especially when he knows exactly what cards his opponents will play. Then there's his boss monsters, Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Restrict. Cards that take complete control of the other monsters on the field and use them for their own power. Pegasus is a manipulative villain, and that's reflective in his dueling, and he knows what his opponents will do with his Millennium Eye. He can predict his opponent's moves and respond accordingly. Of course, after being beaten by Yugi, Pegasus became a more laid-back character, and while he wasn't as intrinsic to the plot of Yu-Gi-Oh! After this, he did become a much more neutral character. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, he does actually take an interest in the plot and the characters, even getting to duel once in GX, showing that he still had the skills in defeating two opponents at the same time. And he also helps the cast when they are trapped in another world by creating a powerful new card that would help the cast break across dimensions.
Okay, I was kind of with you until that last bit.
Yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX is on crack at times. Still, I find Pegasus to be an entertaining character, and while he became a much more level-headed character in the anime, his first excursion is a lot different. So, we need to go back to the beginning. Pegasus J. Crawford is one of the major antagonists and one of the first big ones in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist manga. Before this, Yugimoto had to face off against several other villains, including Seto Kaiba, the Spirit of the Millennium Ring, and even at one point, Shoddy. Pegasus wasn't the first major opponent that Yugi faced who had a Millennium item, but it was Pegasus who first had the most extensive way to defeat Yugi. There are quite a few differences between the anime and manga version of Pegasus, and I'm not just talking about how his eye got carved out. Pegasus's motives are slightly different. You see, Pegasus wasn't interested in the Millennium items. He didn't need them in conjunction with Kaiba Corp's technology. In fact, in the manga, Pegasus was more or less interested in getting the solid vision technology so he could use it to make his dead lover's illusion become more lifelike. To give context, Kaiba at the time was left in a coma after losing to Yugi in the Death Tea arc of the original manga. Because of that, the Kaiba Corp shares were beginning to fall rapidly, and the company was in bad shape. Pegasus Pegasus began his hostile takeover of the company, but before he could buy it and gain access to the technology he wanted, the shareholders presented a requirement before they would hand the reins over to Pegasus, and that was to defeat Yugimoto in a public duel. That in turn would restore the company's good name. I mean, that's all well and good, but Kaiba Corp literally had a competition where Yugi and his friends had to survive literal death games, and Kaiba even hired an actual serial killer to kill Yugi and his friends. So, good luck with that. Still, this is quite different from the anime version, and it makes sense too, especially when you consider that Pegasus seemed to not really trust the Millennium Item's power in that regard, especially since he was only given a glimpse of his love and he had lost his eye to the Millennium Item he has. The eye was powerful, but not even that would be enough to bring the dead back to life. To me, Pegasus was much more of a broken man in the manga, hiding his pain of losing his loved one behind his goofy persona. It should also be pointed out that, technically speaking, Pegasus was brainwashed by the Millennium Eye, or to be more precise, a piece of the big bad of the entire series, Zork, to create duel monsters. And the fact that Pegasus was a painter, it worked to have someone to create the art to help spread the shadow games in a modern format. This works pretty well for motivation and adds more to Pegasus as a character, and even more so if we take the Yugioh R manga into account, where we learn that Pegasus also had adoptive sons who wanted to get revenge on Yugi for killing Pegasus, even though it was Bakura. I'm not going to go into much of the Yugioh R manga, but it shows that Pegasus did have a kinder side to him, and that the Millennium Eye did have an effect on him too. It drove him to do whatever he could to see his love again, even had to rip up another person's life. And Pegasus can be a bit more cruel and devious in the manga. Going back to the VHS duel, one thing that is different between this and the anime version is that instead of just going forward with the shadow game, Pegasus actually used a very short freeze frames to influence Yugi's card choices. You see, Yugi had to build his deck in front of the VHS tape, and Pegasus actually did subliminal messaging to make Yugi structure his deck as such. It was a means to make Yugi think that Pegasus could read his mind and throw him off once the actual shadow game began. Then, I'm sure you guys recall how Bandit Keith confronted Pegasus in the last section, with Pegasus pressing a button hidden on the floor and causing Keith to be flung into the ocean. He's okay, folks! But in the manga, Keith confronts Pegasus with a knife, and in response, Pegasus turned Keith's hand into a revolver and forced Keith to off himself. All the while, Pegasus had this soulless look in his eyes. But there's one huge difference between Pegasus in the anime and the manga, and that's his fate. In the manga, Pegasus dies at the end of Duelist Kingdom in a gruesome manner, with Bakura ripping out Pegasus' Millennium Eye, and that's when Pegasus' story ended. But Pegasus was a popular character, and I think it was because of that in the anime and the series afterwards, he was made a much more prominent character and was given a chance to improve. Again, Pegasus was 24 years old, had his whole life ahead of him. It should be pointed out that unlike other villains though, when he lost to Yugi, he honored his defeat and fulfilled his end of the bargains that he made. It wasn't until his life was threatened that he actually did something that would inflict such terrible damage to people unless his life was threatened. Hell, even with Yugi's grandfather in the manga, Pegasus actually bound Grandpa Muto's soul to a portable videotape, and Yugi was actually able to communicate him through Duelist Kingdom via a camcorder. It should also be noted that the iconic duel between Yugi and Joey in the anime is dropped in the manga, something that Pegasus is willing to allow since the two didn't want to fight each other. And it's even shown that Pegasus had his own heart touched because of the bond that they share, even awakening his duelist senses. While there are a lot of similarities, there are quite a few differences between the anime and manga versions of the character, but I find them both to be very good villains, especially when they act as a foil for the main character. One of the greatest underlying themes of Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least in the original series, is bonds, friendship, and of course the relationships between people, and it's exemplified by both Yugi and Pegasus. And that works because they're acting as foils. Pegasus as a character has pretty much lost a lot of what made him a person. The moment that his lover died, he had lapsed into a deep depression. It drove him to seek a way to regain her. Whether it was because of the anime motivation or the manga version, Pegasus was a man possessed by his past and was willing to do whatever he could to regain the bond that he lost, even if it was a facade. Pegasus essentially became a man that could only succeed through manipulation and quite possibly other dirty tricks. And while he did have his goons, Pegasus didn't really have any companions to back him up in his endeavors. Meanwhile, it was thanks to Yugi's bonds that Pegasus' power with the Millennium Eye were negated, and it was because of the combined efforts of Yugi and Yami that they were also able to negate Thousand Eyes' restricts ability and win. There's also the philosophy of dueling. One could argue that during his time against Yugi, Pegasus had a dependence on the mind-scanning abilities of the Millennium Eye, and the moment that Yugi found a way to stop Pegasus, the duel had started with Pegasus' Toon monsters being defeated. It's proven that when Pegasus can't read the minds of either Yugi when they're using their mind shuffle, Pegasus devolved into firing blindly without taking into account the defenses that his opponent had have set, and how he walked right into Yugi's Mirror Force and Kuribo defense. Meanwhile, a lot of the time, Yugi and Yami tend to be a lot more meticulous with their choices of cards as well as how their opponents played, and oftentimes they would use their opponent's own strategies against them. There's also the personality difference. While Pegasus tends to be a lot goofier and a lot more aloof when he's got the advantage, the Yugis tend to take things a lot more seriously, and when their final duel was done, one thing to note is that in the manga, Yugi didn't give Pegasus a penalty game. For those who aren't familiar with the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, a lot of the time when Yami Yugi defeated an opponent before the Duelist manga started, he would place some sort of penalty game onto them. However, when Pegasus was explaining about the potential evil hidden within each of the Millennium items, it shocked Yugi. It sparked something that Yami Yugi really had to consider with his self-introspection about who he is, whether he's evil, and abandoning the penalty games further on from that point. This is why you need to read the manga, because it's a lot added into the cast and how Pegasus actually worked as a foil to Yugi and Yami. There's also the element of the past with Pegasus and the Yugis. Pegasus is a man who's obsessed with his past, as shown with his motivations and even with his love of cartoons, to the point that he put them into his own deck. And then the main plotline with the Yugis is surrounded with the mystery of Yami's past. So both the protagonists and the antagonist here have elements of the past that are welled up within them. Pegasus essentially gave into the powers of the Millennium Eye in a desperate act to reconnect with a woman he loved, and his path was filled with tragedy, and in the manga's case, it ended with him losing his life. While I will happily admit that Pegasus isn't the perfect foil to Yugi, that's more or less Kaiba to me, there's one more interesting thing to talk about Pegasus before we wrap up this video, and that's a parallel to a well-known myth. Yugioh is rife with blatant imagery of Egyptian lore and mythology, but there is a bit of a retelling from Greek mythology done with Pegasus' story, at least from what I understand and doing a little research online. Tell me, my friends, are you familiar with the story of Orpheus and Eurydice? Well, even if you are, it's my video and you need to pad out the runtime. The story of Orpheus, more specifically the death of Eurydice, goes as such. Eurydice, the love of Orpheus, dies from a viper bite. Orpheus, discovering her body, falls into grief, playing songs that mourn his loss. Having heard his sad songs, the nymphs and the gods wept, and gave Orpheus advice to travel to the underworld to find his love. With his skills in the arts, Orpheus managed to convince the god of the underworld, Hades, to allow Eurydice to return to the land of the living, but on one condition: that Orpheus could not lay his eyes upon her until they reached the upper world. And as Orpheus stepped foot into the land of the living, he turned to look at his love, forgetting that they both needed to be in the upper world for the condition to be met. And since Eurydice wasn't in the living world, she faded away, lost from Orpheus forever. Now, obviously from what I told you, there's a whole thing of losing the lover that adds a parallel to the stories of Orpheus and Pegasus. But there's a lot more to it. Take the descent into the underworld that Orpheus had gone through. I can easily liken that to be when Pegasus made his own trip to Egypt, traveling in the tomb where the Millennium items were used as a mirror to Orpheus's tale. The Millennium Eye was the item that acted in the place of Hades, offering Pegasus a chance to bring his dead wife back. Albeit he had to go through his own trial in order to accomplish that, which leads to Pegasus almost accomplishing his goals of reviving his wife Cecilia, but because of his reliance on the Millennium Eye and his own egotism, he fell short and lost his wife forever. And if we want to continue with the manga version, later Orpheus gets killed as well, with Pegasus ending in a similar fate. To add my own spin on this, I'd like to point out that both Orpheus and Pegasus are artists, with Orpheus being a musician and Pegasus being a painter, and their skills were used in their quest to get back their lovers in one way or another. With Orpheus, he used his music to convince Hades to help him. Meanwhile, Pegasus was using his painting skills to create a painting that he could put on a card for the solid vision plan he had for Cecilia, as well as duel monsters as well. These are just some of the parallels, and I can see some influence from the tale of Orpheus being used for Pegasus. Of course, I'm not the only one who sees this. In my research, I've seen some people bring this up, and I thought it'd be a nice little fun idea to bring up with the character in this video. It makes sense to me because the point of the tale of Orpheus is trust and respect. Because if you really think about it, why did Pegasus need to perform a hostile takeover of Kaiba Corp to get the technology? It's established that Pegasus and Kaiba were business associates, and if Pegasus had offered industrial illusions and services to Kaiba or even became business partners, Pegasus could have had a better chance of accessing the technology, especially since Kaiba is a huge fan of his card game. I'm just saying there's a chance Pegasus could have done this in a much easier manner, but he didn't because he lacks trust in others, at least prior to the Duelist Kingdom tournament. I'm probably reading way too much into that. Still fun though. Regardless of which version of Pegasus we're talking about for this video, I do believe that he is probably one of the best villains in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. And not just because he's the worst villain in the anime, and I'm not talking Season 0 here. No, it's because Pegasus is an interesting villain and concept, especially for a shonen series. He didn't need to be strong in terms of muscles, he was strong with his wit, his abilities, and personality. He was a creative character who literally made the game that the characters play throughout the series, and thus has an anchor throughout the rest of the universe. Sure, after 5Ds, it's hard to tell what his influence was in the anime at that point, if he even existed at all, especially since there were different timelines and changing dimensions. But for me, Pegasus is what a villain should be. He stands out, he's memorable, he's got a personality and was entertaining to watch whenever he's on screen. So to me, he's a real high bar for villains in Yu-Gi-Oh! But don't get me wrong, it's not like there aren't other villains in Yu-Gi-Oh! That are just as good as Pegasus. It's just what their roles are, and I feel that Pegasus is one of the most memorable villains in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. And I hope you guys can see why I think Pegasus is a great villain. So if you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, put a comment down below saying, Yugi boy! It helps out a lot, and make sure you're subscribed if you want to see more content like this. In any case, I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and remember folks, let's have fun in a world of toons.